Hello everyone, in this lesson I will talk about the topics we will cover during this course. In the first chapter, we will discuss the training content. In the second chapter we will discuss the installation and basic settings. In the first lesson we will talk about the sample lab project. In the second lesson we will make our preparations for installation. In the third lesson we will install the FortiGate virtual machine on VMware ESXi. In our fourth lesson, I will explain how to install on VMware Workstation Pro so that you can do lab at home or in the office. And in our last lesson, we will complete the second chapter by talking about basic settings and dashboard. When we come to the third part, we will deal with network and routing. In our first lesson, we will set up interface and zone, DHCP server in our second lesson, static route in our third lesson, OSPF in our fourth lesson, BGP in our fifth lesson, point-to-point protocol over Ethernet settings in WAN interface in our sixth lesson, and Ether channel lab in our last lesson. When we get to chapter 4, we will discuss policy and object. In our first lesson I will show you how to add objects for addresses and services, and in our second lesson we will make an example for firewall policy. In our third lesson, we will make an example for time-based policies. In our fourth lesson we will do an example of deny of service policy in IP version 4. In our next lesson we will do virtual IP port forwarding, and in our last lesson we will make an example for static and AT. When we come to the fifth chapter, we will talk about SD-WAN. Our first lesson will be an introduction to SD-WAN, and in our second lesson, we will talk about how to create an SD-WAN zone and how to make interfaces members into this zone. In our third lesson, we will talk about SD-WAN performance SLAs, and in our last lesson, we will complete chapter 5 by giving examples of SD-WAN rules. When we come to chapter 6, we will talk about security profiles, SSL inspection in our first lesson, antivirus profile in our second lesson, web filter in our third lesson, DNS filter in our fourth lesson, application control in our fifth lesson, IPS in our sixth lesson, and we will complete this chapter by talking about file filter in our last lesson. When we come to the seventh chapter, we will discuss user and authentication. Our first lesson will be Active Directory integration. In our second lesson we will talk about how to create a user-based firewall policy. In our third lesson I will talk about how to do authentication with Captive Portal, and in our last lesson we will complete this chapter by talking about how to manage guest users. When we come to the eighth chapter, we will do FortiGate to FortiGate site to site VPN in our first lesson, and in our second lesson, we will make an IPsec VPN example from FortiGate firewall to Cisco router. In our third lesson, we will study remote access VPN. In this lesson we will make an example of split tunnel, and in the next lesson we will complete the VPN by making a full tunnel example. In the ninth chapter, we will cover device management. In our first lesson I will explain how you can create admin profiles and admin users. In our second lesson, we will discuss high availability. In our third lesson, we will talk about featured visibility on the firewall. In the next lesson we will talk about log settings, and in our last lesson, we will complete this chapter by covering backup and restore topics. In the last chapter, we will cover the subject of virtual domain. In our first lesson, we will make an introduction to VDOM, and in our second lesson, we will complete our training by configuring virtual domain. That's the curriculum of our course in a nutshell, so goodbye to see you in our next lesson.